Friends, before we go any further, just pause for a second and imagine this. Imagine you are inside this plane. You're sitting next to your family. Your friends are around you. Laughter fills the cabin. No fear, no warning, just another normal day. It's the morning of October 12th, 1972. The aircraft rolls down the runway in Uruguay and lifts smoothly into the sky. This is supposed to be a simple journey. The destination, Santiago, Chile. Inside the cabin are young rugby players, confident and full of life, travelling with their relatives and closest friends. In total, 45 people. And right now, you are one of them. Under normal conditions, this flight takes less than 3 hours, a short trip, almost routine. But between takeoff and landing stands one of the most unforgiving natural barriers on Earth, the Andes Mountains. Through your window, the Andes stretch endlessly across the continent, the longest mountain range in the world. Their peaks rise so high that only the Himalayas surpass them. From a distance, they look peaceful, majestic. But no one inside this plane truly understands what those mountains can do. As the aircraft approaches the range on October 12th, the mood begins to change. Outside, dark clouds gather, winds grow stronger. The pilots realize the danger. There's no safe way forward. A decision is made to land in Mendoza, Argentina, and wait. That night, you rest, believing tomorrow will be better, unaware that everything is already moving toward disaster. The next day, October 13th. At exactly 2:18 in the afternoon, the engines roar again. The plane lifts off once more. The sky looks clear. The flight feels smooth. Around you, people relax. Conversations return. Some even laugh. For nearly an hour, it feels like the danger is behind you. Then, at 3:21 p.m., the descent begins. The pilots believe Santiago is close. But what no one knows, not the pilots, not the passengers, not you, is that the plane is still deep inside the Andes. Towering mountains surround you on all sides. Suddenly, the aircraft jolts violently. Turbulence slams into the plane. It shakes hard. Your body presses into the seat. Thick clouds swallow everything outside the windows, pure white. Inside the cockpit, alarms begin to scream. Lights flash. No one understands what's happening. Some rugby players laugh nervously, cracking jokes, trying to fight fear with humour. Then, someone looks out the window. The clouds begin to thin. And in that moment, your heart drops. A massive mountain wall is right there. Too close, terrifyingly close. As the plane bursts out of the clouds, the pilots see it too. A sheer rock face fills the windshield. Panic explodes. The controls are pulled back hard. Engines scream at full power. Warning alarms shriek. There is no space left, no time left. The effort fails. The tail of the plane slams into the mountain. The impact is brutal. The rear section is ripped clean away. The last 2 rows of seats vanish into the air behind you. 3 people are gone in an instant, lost to the void. For a brief, horrifying moment, the rest of the plane climbs, then gravity takes over. Another impact. The left wing tears off. More passengers are thrown from the aircraft, disappearing into the snow below. What remains, the front section, slams onto a glacier. It skids across solid ice for nearly 700 meters at around 350 kilometers per hour before crashing to a stop. The violence of it is beyond words. Inside the wreckage, everything is destroyed. Seats are torn loose, metal is twisted. The cockpit is crushed beyond recognition. Both pilots are dead. The plane comes to rest high in the Andes, 3,570 meters above sea level, on a nameless mountain far from the world. And yet, against every possible odd, 33 of the 45 people on board are still alive. You have survived the crash. But now you are injured, freezing, surrounded by endless snow. You don't know where you are. There is no radio, no signal, no rescue in sight. Later it will be discovered that the plane drifted nearly 80 kilometers off course, and this is only the beginning. Neither the survivors trapped in this frozen wilderness, nor you listening now, can imagine the impossible choices and terrifying reality that lie ahead. This is the devastating true story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. At first, the outside world believed everyone on board had died. Search operations began almost immediately. Among the survivors were 2 young men studying medicine. They didn't hesitate. Despite their own injuries, they started checking every passenger, identifying who was alive and who needed urgent care. The situation was grim. Many had catastrophic wounds. One of them was 23-year-old Fernando Parrado, who lay unconscious, his skull fractured, trapped in a deep coma. The medical students worked tirelessly, using whatever knowledge and scraps they had to keep people alive. Meanwhile, less than an hour after the plane vanished from radar, Chile's Air Search and Rescue Service was alerted. 4 aircraft were dispatched to scan the mountains. From evening until nightfall, crews searched desperately, but they found nothing. Radio signals were analysed, and rescuers concluded the crash must have occurred in an extremely remote and unreachable area. The challenge was overwhelming. The aircraft was white, and it had come down in a world of white snow and ice. Spotting it from the air was nearly impossible. As night fell on October 13th, the survivors clung to hope. They believed they only needed to endure one night, just one. They tried to block the freezing wind, huddling inside the shattered shell of the plane, convinced rescue would arrive by morning. But the cold was merciless. By dawn, 5 more injured passengers had died during the night. The number of survivors dropped from 33 to 28. Those still alive had no choice but to adapt. They turned the broken fuselage into a fragile shelter, unaware that the world had already begun to move on, believing they were gone forever. They packed the torn luggage, broken seats and chunks of ice tightly against the open rear of the aircraft, sealing it as best they could to trap what little warmth remained inside. It wasn't comfortable, but it was survival. By the morning of October 14th, the rescue effort had expanded dramatically. 11 aircraft from Argentina, Chile and Uruguay filled the skies, sweeping across the Andes in coordinated patterns. The cruel irony was this: the crash site was actually inside the designated search zone. The rescuers were close, painfully close, yet still the wreckage remained invisible to them. Desperate to be seen, the survivors tried anything they could imagine. They used lipstick to write a giant SOS on the roof of the plane. The first letter went up easily, But soon they realized the lipstick would never last long enough to finish the message. So they changed tactics. They dragged suitcases out onto the snow and arranged them into a massive cross, hoping the dark shapes would stand out against the white ground. That same day, hope surged and then shattered. Not one, not two, but 3 aircraft flew directly overhead. The survivors screamed until their throats burned. They waved their arms, jumped, cried, begged the sky to notice them. But the planes passed on, unaware. Another day slipped away with no rescue. On October 15th, a harsh truth became impossible to ignore. They needed water. Snow surrounded them, but eating it directly would only lower their body temperature and speed death. One passenger, Fito Schroch, came up with a solution. Using a piece of metal torn from the plane, they created a makeshift solar collector. Sunlight heated the metal, slowly melting ice. Drop by drop, they captured the water in empty wine bottles. It was painfully slow, but it worked. They also learned to adapt in other ways. Seat cushions were strapped to their feet and used like snowshoes, allowing them to move across the deep snow without sinking. The wool from the seat covers was torn out and wrapped around their bodies for insulation against the brutal cold. On October 16th, 3 days after the crash, something remarkable happened. Fernando Parrado opened his eyes. He had been unconscious since the impact, trapped in a coma. As awareness returned, so did unbearable reality. He learned that his mother had died in the crash. Worse still, his 19-year-old sister was gravely injured. Parrado devoted himself to her completely, bringing her water, sharing his tiny food portions, refusing to give up. But 8 days after the crash, her injuries proved too severe. She died in the frozen mountains. Moments like these expose a terrifying truth about life, how fragile and unpredictable it really is. None of us know how much time we have. That's why people say we should live fully without delay. But even as that thought crosses the mind, another question follows. How? How do you truly live when daily pressure and responsibilities consume everything? That question lingers here, unanswered, while these survivors face something far more immediate. Most of them had never even seen snow before. Now they were trapped at extreme altitude, enduring temperatures as low as -30 degrees Celsius, with almost no food, no proper clothing, and no certainty of rescue. As if that weren't enough, another danger emerged: snow blindness. The sun's ultraviolet rays reflected fiercely off the snow, damaging the eyes. Out of everyone there, they had only 3 pairs of sunglasses to share. Then came October 21st, 8 days after the crash. The unthinkable happened. Search and rescue teams officially called off the operation. From their perspective, survival after so many days seemed impossible. The mountains had won. Unaware of this decision, the survivors stumbled upon a small transistor radio wedged between the plane seats. One of them, rugby player Roy Harley, had a knack for electronics. Working patiently, they extended an improvised antenna and adjusted the components again and again. Finally, the radio crackled to life. It only worked one way. They could hear the outside world, but they couldn't speak back. 11 days after the crash, the radio delivered devastating news. The search had been cancelled. The effect was crushing. Some survivors broke down and cried openly. Others folded their hands and prayed, believing that if the world had abandoned them, maybe God still hadn't. Fernando Parrado stayed quiet. He didn't collapse or scream. Something else was taking shape in his mind. By this point, hunger had become unbearable. Their supplies were pitiful from the start. 8 chocolate bars, a tin of mussels, 3 small jars of jam, a box of almonds, a handful of dates, some candies, dried plums, and a few bottles of wine. They had rationed everything carefully, eating almost nothing each day. Parrado once stretched a single chocolate-covered peanut over 3 days, eating it bit by bit. But even that discipline couldn't stop the inevitable. At nearly 3,800 metres above sea level, there were no plants, no animals, nothing living to hunt or gather. By the 11th day, the food was completely gone. In desperation, some tried chewing cotton from the seats or pieces of leather. It only made them weaker and sicker. Starvation loomed. And in that moment, faced with certain death, they confronted an unthinkable choice. The only remaining source of nourishment was the bodies of those who had already died, their friends, their classmates, their own family members. The idea surfaced slowly, painfully. Canessa was the first to confront it directly. Some survivors couldn't bring themselves to do it. They refused, horrified. But 2 days later, when weakness overtook willpower and death felt close enough to touch, resistance collapsed. To live crossed a line no one ever imagines crossing. By October 29th, 16 days after the crash, even this last source of food was disappearing fast. Hunger was tightening its grip again. There was no strategy, no clear next move. No one had answers. It felt like they had reached the absolute bottom. And then, that night, the mountains spoke. A deep, thunderous roar tore through the darkness. Before anyone could react, an avalanche came crashing down. Tons of snow rushed from above, smashing into the wreckage and burying it completely. In seconds, the plane vanished under a suffocating blanket of ice and snow. One survivor later recalled the terrifying moment, certain he was about to die, his body reacting uncontrollably as panic took over. 19 people were trapped alive, crushed into a tiny pocket beneath the snow. The air was running out. Panic spread. Fernando Parrado grabbed a metal pole and stabbed upward, desperately punching a narrow hole through the snow to let oxygen seep in. That small opening kept them alive. For 2 exhausting days, they clawed and dug through the snow, inch by inch, until they finally broke through to the surface. But freedom didn't last. As soon as they emerged, they saw another snowstorm rolling toward them. Going back into the frozen cave felt safer than facing the open mountain, so they retreated once more. For 3 more days, they remained trapped in that cramped, frozen space. When the storm finally passed and they surfaced again, a crushing realization hit them all at once. No one was coming. Rescue was not happening. If they wanted to live, they would have to save themselves. Sitting beside the wreckage and hoping was no longer an option. If death was waiting anyway, then they would face it moving forward, not standing still. Among the survivors, Roberto Canessa, Fernando Parrado, and Antonio Vizintin were the strongest. The group made a hard decision. These 3 would get extra food and the warmest clothes. They would attempt the impossible, walk out of the Andes and find help. The first challenge was figuring out where they were. Before the crash, the co-pilot had mentioned they had already passed the city of Curicó. Based on that, they believed that walking west for a few kilometers would bring them into rural Chile. That assumption would nearly cost them everything. The co-pilot had been wrong, completely wrong. The crash site was actually about 89 kilometers east of that point, deep inside the Andes. But they didn't know that yet. After resting and gathering strength, on November 15th, 33 days after the crash, the three men began their journey. Hours into the trek, moving eastward, they stumbled upon a broken section of their own aircraft, the tail that had torn away during the crash. Inside it, they discovered a miracle. Suitcases filled with clothes, boxes of chocolate, 3 meat patties, a bottle of rum, comic books, medicine, and most importantly, two-way radio, one that could transmit signals, not just receive them. Hope surged again. They decided to spend the night there. The following day, after walking farther east, a new idea formed. What if they could power the radio? What if they could send an SOS? They returned to the main wreckage and found heavy aircraft batteries, each weighing around 24 kilograms. Too heavy to carry back. Instead, they tried bringing the radio knowledge to the batteries. Roy Harley, who understood electronics, joined them. But once again, reality crushed hope. The aircraft system ran on 115 volts AC. The batteries delivered 24 volts DC. There was no way to connect them. For days they experimented, trying everything they could imagine. In the end, they had to accept the truth. The radio would never work. Walking west was the only path left. Then, on December 11th, 59 days after the crash, disaster struck again. Another avalanche swept through the camp. 3 more lives were lost. 1 survivor later described the horror of being pinned beneath the snow, unable to move, surrounded by a silence more terrifying than noise. When the snow finally settled, only 16 people remained alive. If anyone was going to cross the mountains to the west, they needed protection from the night. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Surviving the darkness without shelter was impossible. Among them was an 18-year-old named Carlos Miguel Rodriguez. He remembered something simple yet powerful. His mother had taught him how to sew. He still had his needle and sewing kit. Using scraps of fabric, insulation, and sheer determination, he stitched together a sleeping bag. Not just an idea, a real one. December 12th arrived. 2 full months had passed since the crash. Parado, Canessa, and Vizintin stepped onto the glacier with no climbing gear, no maps, no compass, and no training. They knew only one thing. Chile lay to the west, and west meant up before it meant down. They still believed help was only a few days away, so they packed just 3 days' worth of meat. What followed was brutal. Like children facing a snow wall for the first time, they tried to climb straight up. Hands and feet scraping, slipping, sliding. For every step forward, they slid back half a step. Progress was agony. To fight the cold, Parado layered everything he had. 3 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters over a t-shirt, 4 pairs of socks, even a plastic shopping bag wrapped around his feet. The cold was relentless. The air was thin. Every breath burned. There was no equipment, no experience, no safety net, and still they climbed. The sleeping bag they carried would soon decide whether this journey ended in survival or silence. The sleeping bag they had sewn together proved to be their lifeline once night fell. During daylight, they forced themselves forward with careful, measured steps. When darkness returned, 3 men crawled into that single bag, pressing their bodies together to share warmth. As soon as the sun appeared again, they were back on their feet. 1 step, then another. They kept going. The 2nd day passed, then the 3rd, and on the morning of the 4th day, reality struck them hard. The mountains didn't end. They stretched on endlessly. What they had believed would be a short journey was nothing but a cruel illusion. Their food was nearly gone. Someone had to turn back. Vizintin made the decision. He would return to the crash site so the remaining food could last longer for Parrado and Canessa. On December 15th, Vizintin began his descent. Going down was shockingly easy. He slid using an airplane seat like a sled and reached the wreckage in just 1 hour. It had taken them 3 exhausting days to climb that mountain, yet only 60 minutes to come back down. Parrado and Canessa pressed on alone. 3 hours later, they reached the summit. What awaited them there nearly broke them. In every direction, as far as they could see, there was nothing but snow and towering peaks. No valleys, no signs of life, just endless mountains. The thin air stole their breath. Words wouldn't come. Thoughts barely formed. Everything they hoped for vanished in that moment. But Parrado refused to look away. He scanned the horizon again and again. And then, far to the west, he saw something different. 2 distant peaks without snow, bare rock. That had to mean lower altitude. That had to mean life. They chose that direction. Giving up was no longer an option. For days, Parrado and Canessa kept walking. Hunger weakened them. Pain followed every step. Eventually, the landscape began to change. They reached a valley. And in that valley, they saw something they hadn't seen in over 2 months. A river. Reaching water felt like a miracle. Following the river meant going downhill. It meant hope. They kept moving alongside it, hour after hour, day after day. And then, on December 20th, after 9 days of relentless trekking, they saw proof that they weren't alone anymore. Cows, grazing in a field. Civilization. Their bodies were beyond exhaustion. They could barely stand. And then Parrado noticed something else. Across the river, a man on horseback. Parrado tried to shout, but the roar of the water swallowed his voice. By sheer chance, one of the riders noticed them. He yelled back a single word. Tomorrow. He would return. The next day, the man came back, carrying paper and a pencil. He tied the paper to a stone and threw it across the river. For the first time since the crash, the outside world could hear them. Parrado wrote in Spanish, explaining everything, that they had survived a plane crash, that they were from Uruguay, that injured friends were still trapped in the mountains, that they were starving and weak and desperately needed help. The man who received the note was a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan, read the message, nodded, and signalled that he understood. As he spoke with the others, something clicked. He remembered hearing about a missing plane weeks earlier. When his companions realised what this meant, they were stunned. Surviving 2 months in the Andes seemed impossible. Sergio threw them bread across the river. Then he rode for 10 straight hours, pushing westward without stopping. Even then, he was still far from the nearest settlement. When he finally reached town, the news reached the local army, and soon after, military headquarters in Santiago. Parrado and Canessa were taken on horseback to Los Maitenes, where they collapsed into real rest for the first time. Driven only by hope, they had walked 61 kilometers in 10 days. Canessa had lost half his body weight, down to just 44 kilograms. Once their story spread, it captured the world. It sounded unreal. The Chilean Air Force immediately launched a rescue mission, sending helicopters into the mountains. Parrado helped. The officers locate the wreckage using the pilot's flight chart he had carried all this way. From the air, the crash site was finally identified. On December 22, 1972, 70 days after the plane went down, rescue helicopters reached the survivors. They arrived just in time. 16 people were pulled from the Andes alive. Their bodies were broken by altitude sickness, dehydration, starvation, and injuries, but they survived, and they recovered. This story stands as a reminder of what hope, determination, and humanity can achieve. When people refuse to surrender, even the impossible can be overcome. That is why this tragedy carries another name: the miracle of the Andes. For more real stories like this, subscribe to Reality Files.